Something is happening in the sky tonight that has been happening every clear night for your entire life, and your parents' entire lives, and their parents' entire lives, going back further than anyone in your community can count. The moon is at a specific point in its cycle. Not full, not yet. The specific crescent shape it is currently displaying, on the specific side of the disk where the light falls, at the specific altitude it occupies in the sky at this specific hour of the night. All of this is information. Not the kind of information that requires a degree to decode or a device to receive. The kind of information that any person who has paid sustained attention to the night sky across multiple years of their life can read as naturally as you read a clock face. And you know, not approximately, not with a vague sense, but with the specific practical certainty that survival critical knowledge produces, that you have approximately 8 days before the moon is full, which means approximately 20 days before it is new again, which means approximately 14 days before the first of the season's major plant foods will be at peak readiness for collection, which means that the group should begin moving towards the valley where those foods grow in approximately 10 days to be in position when they are ready. You did not write any of this down. It is not written in any book. There is no calendar on your wall and no notification on any device. But you know with the specific embodied certainty of a mind that has tracked this information continuously since you were old enough to be outside at night, you know exactly where you are in time. This is ancient timekeeping, and it is considerably more sophisticated than most people have ever stopped to think about. Let's start with what timekeeping actually is and why it matters, because the sophistication of the question is not immediately obvious. Timekeeping is, at its most fundamental, the tracking of cyclical patterns in the natural world for the purpose of coordinating behavior with those patterns and with other people. The sun rises and sets on a roughly 24-hour cycle. The moon goes through its phases on a roughly 29.5-day cycle. The seasons cycle on a roughly 365-day pattern driven by Earth's orbital relationship with the sun. Plants fruit, animals migrate, rains arrive and depart, rivers flood and recede, all on cyclical schedules that repeat with enough regularity to be predictable and with enough consequence to justify the tracking effort. For ancient humans, mobile hunter-gatherers whose survival depended on being in the right place at the right time to exploit seasonal resources. The ability to track these cycles and predict where in those cycles you currently were was not an intellectual luxury. It was survival infrastructure, as fundamental as shelter or food knowledge. A community that arrived at the salmon run site 2 weeks late, after the peak of the run had passed, faced a dramatically worse caloric situation than one that arrived at exactly the right time. A community that missed the specific week when a particular plant food was at peak nutritional density and collection efficiency lost a significant annual caloric contribution. Timing mattered. Knowing where you were in time mattered correspondingly. The problem is that cycles of different lengths do not align neatly with each other, and keeping track of where you are in each relevant cycle simultaneously in your head, without external recording devices across months and years and decades of a mobile life, is a genuinely challenging cognitive task. Ancient humans solved this problem. The solutions they developed were elegant, practical, and in some cases far more technically sophisticated than popular assumptions about ancient cognitive capability would suggest. Let's start with the day, because it is the most fundamental unit of ancient time, and its tracking is both the simplest and reveals important things about how ancient minds related to time. The day-night cycle is the most obvious and most reliable temporal marker available in the natural world. The sun rises, moves across the sky, and sets with a regularity that, over human timescales, is effectively perfect. For basic daily timekeeping, knowing approximately what time it is within the waking day, ancient humans read the position of the sun in the sky with a precision that modern people who rely on clocks have. Largely lost, but that is readily recoverable with practice. The sun's position in the sky encodes information about the time of day in 2 dimensions: its altitude above the horizon and its compass direction. In the morning, the sun is low in the sky and in the east. At midday, it is at its highest altitude and due south, in the northern hemisphere. In the afternoon, it is descending and moving toward the west. At any given geographic location and season, the sun's altitude and direction at a specific time of day is consistent from day to day, allowing a practiced observer to estimate the time with considerable accuracy. Traditional peoples studied in ethnographic research consistently demonstrate the ability to estimate time of day from sun position with accuracy that, in tests comparing them to individuals using watches, typically falls within 15 to 20 minutes. Not perfect, but functional. Ancient humans navigating a day's activities, knowing when to leave camp to intercept prey at a specific location, knowing how much daylight remained for a planned activity, were working with this kind of solar time reading continuously and skillfully. Beyond sun position, the behavior of animals provided secondary time of day cues that ancient humans with detailed ecological knowledge read as naturally as they read sun position. The dawn chorus of birds. The specific temporal sequence of bird species beginning to vocalize in the pre-dawn and early morning hours was a biological clock that any ancient person with adequate bird knowledge could read with accuracy. Different species begin vocalizing at consistent times relative to sunrise, producing a dawn sequence that encodes time information with a specificity that trained listeners can extract. The silencing of specific bird species at specific times of day, the emergence of specific insects at specific hours, the behavior of prey animals at dawn, midday, and dusk. The biological world was clocking out temporal signals continuously that ancient humans were reading and using. Let's talk about the moon, because lunar tracking was almost certainly the most important monthly timekeeping system in the ancient world, and its sophistication in traditional and ancient cultures is consistently underappreciated. The moon's cycle of phases, from new moon through waxing crescent, first quarter, waxing gibbous, full moon, waning gibbous, last quarter, waning crescent, and back to new, takes approximately 29.5 days to complete and is visually dramatic enough to be tracked by anyone who pays regular attention to the night sky. The specific phase of the moon is unambiguous for most of the cycle: the exact shape of the illuminated portion, the side on which the illumination appears, the altitude at which the moon rises and sets. All of these are encoders of phase information that trained observers read with specificity. The functional applications of lunar phase tracking in the ancient world were multiple and important. Many aquatic resources, shellfish, certain fish species, coastal invertebrates, show reproductive and behavioral cycles that are phase-locked to the lunar cycle. Ancient coastal communities that understood the specific lunar phases at which certain shellfish were most productive, certain fish most catchable, certain marine resources most accessible, had significant caloric advantages over communities without this knowledge. The tidal patterns that governed access to coastal resources are directly driven by lunar cycles and trackable through lunar phase observation. Plant reproductive cycles in many species are also phase correlated with the lunar cycle, reflecting the evolutionary history of these plants in environments where lunar light affected pollinator behavior and other ecological processes. Traditional agricultural and gathering communities worldwide maintain specific lunar phase knowledge for planting and harvesting that, in systematic studies, often shows genuine empirical grounding rather than being purely ritualistic. But beyond specific resource correlations, the lunar cycle served ancient communities as a reliable, universally visible monthly calendar. Communities that tracked lunar phases had access to a shared temporal reference framework that allowed coordination across distances. If two groups agreed to meet at a specific location at the next full moon, both groups had access to the same observable event to determine when that time was approaching. The specific practice of tally marking lunar cycles, making a mark for each day of the moon's cycle, accumulating marks through the cycle, restarting the tally at new moon, is the specific behavior that produced the ancient tally marks that are among the oldest potential evidence of deliberate timekeeping in the archaeological record. Let's talk about those tally marks, because this is where the archaeological evidence for ancient timekeeping becomes direct and fascinating. The Ishango bone, found in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo and dating to approximately 20,000 years ago, is a baboon fibula with a piece of quartz crystal embedded in one end and a series of notch marks arranged in groups along 3 columns on the surface. The specific arrangement of the notches, the groupings, and their specific counts has been interpreted by multiple researchers as a lunar calendar, a systematic record of lunar phases across multiple months, with the notch groups corresponding to the different phases of the moon or to specific day counts within the lunar cycle. The Lubombo bone, found in the Lubombo Mountains of Eswatini and dating to approximately 43,000 years ago, is a baboon fibula with 29 distinct notches cut into it. 29 is the approximate number of days in a lunar cycle. A bone with 29 marks on it, found in an ancient habitation context, is a compelling candidate for a lunar month tally, a device for counting the days of a single lunar cycle, or for tracking position within the monthly cycle. These objects are not proven to be calendrical devices. Alternative interpretations exist and are debated, but the specific combination of their material, their context, the number and arrangement of their marks, and the functional need for lunar tracking that we have established as genuine and significant makes the calendrical interpretation at minimum plausible and at maximum quite compelling. The older and more extensive category of evidence involves incised marks on bones, antlers, and stones from multiple ancient sites across a wide geographic range and spanning tens of thousands of years. Many of these marks appear in grouped patterns that do not correspond to any obvious tool use function, and that researchers have proposed represent various forms of sequential marking, counts of days, notations of specific events, accumulations across time that constitute a form of recording rather than decoration or tool use. The challenge of interpreting these marks is real. Without a complete cultural context, distinguishing a tally from a decorative pattern from a practice object is difficult, but the cumulative weight of the evidence, the frequency with which ancient objects show marks and patterns consistent with lunar cycle counts, the specific numerical groupings that appear repeatedly, the functional case for lunar tracking that ancient subsistence patterns establish, makes a strong circumstantial case that ancient humans were deliberately tracking the lunar cycle through some form of physical marking technology from a very early period. Let's talk about the sun and the year, because annual timekeeping, tracking where you are in the seasonal cycle across the full year, required understanding solar patterns that go beyond simple day-length observation. The year is defined by Earth's orbital cycle around the sun, which produces the seasons through the changing angle of solar radiation at any given location. The specific astronomical events that mark the year's key points. The solstices, when day length is at its annual maximum or minimum, and the equinoxes, when day length equals night length, are observable through careful, long-term attention to solar behavior. The winter solstice, the shortest day of the year in the northern hemisphere, occurring around December 21st, is the specific astronomical event that marks the annual turning point at which days begin lengthening again. The recognition of this event requires tracking day length or sun position at a consistent observation point across multiple years, because the change in day length and sun position across the weeks surrounding the solstice is gradual enough that a single year's observation would not definitively identify the turning point. But across multiple years of consistent observation from consistent locations, the pattern becomes unambiguous. Ancient humans who tracked sunrise and sunset positions, noting where on the horizon the sun rose and set on sequential days, would have observed the specific annual pattern in which the sunrise and sunset positions move progressively north through spring and summer, reach their northernmost points at the summer solstice, and then begin moving south. The southernmost position of sunrise and sunset, reached at the winter solstice, would have been identifiable as a specific, consistent, annually recurring astronomical event. The functional significance of this identification in ancient subsistence contexts was substantial. The winter solstice represented the turning point of the cold season, the moment after which the trend was toward longer days and eventually warmer temperatures. For communities managing their food stores across a winter, knowing precisely when the solstice had passed, knowing that the worst was over in the astronomical sense, had a real practical and psychological significance. Let's talk about landscape-based timekeeping, because ancient humans encoded temporal information into their physical environments in ways that created reliable, durable, community-shared reference points. The specific position of sunrise and sunset relative to landscape features, a particular mountain peak, a distinctive rock formation, a specific tree at the horizon, changes across the year in a predictable way that any consistent observer will eventually notice. Once noticed, these landscape-sun alignments function as natural calendrical markers, reliable date indicators that require no technology beyond knowing the specific landscape and paying sustained attention to it. Traditional communities worldwide maintain knowledge of specific landscape alignments associated with specific annual events. The specific moment when the sun rises directly over a particular mountain peak marks a specific date. The moment when the sun sets in a specific gap between hills marks another. These alignments are natural astronomical instruments created by the specific geography of specific places and readable by anyone with the relevant cultural knowledge of what to look for and what it means. The accumulation of landscape alignment knowledge across generations of consistent observation at specific locations produces a community temporal reference system of considerable precision. A community that has been observing the same landscape from the same location for multiple generations knows when every significant annual event occurs relative to the local landscape's astronomical markers. Their annual calendar is written in the hills and horizon, readable to those with the knowledge, requiring no text or formal recording. This kind of landscape-based astronomical knowledge may be one of the primary ancient timekeeping mechanisms that is most completely invisible in the archaeological record because it leaves no physical artifact. The knowledge existed in people's minds and in the specific relationship between specific places and the sun's annual path. Information that has mostly been lost as traditional communities lost access to their ancestral observation locations and as the accumulated intergenerational observation records embedded in those locations were severed. Let's talk about biological calendars because the natural world provided ancient humans with a distributed timekeeping system of extraordinary richness that they read with the fluency of a language they had been learning since childhood. Every element of the natural world that showed consistent seasonal behavior was a temporal marker that ancient humans with ecological knowledge could read to determine where in the annual cycle they were. The first flowering of specific plant species, the arrival of specific migratory bird species, the emergence of specific insects, the calving of specific large mammals, the color change of specific plants in autumn, the molting patterns of specific animal species. All of these are consistent, annually recurring biological events that occur at predictable points in the seasonal cycle. Ancient humans with detailed ecological knowledge of their territories had access to dozens of such biological temporal markers across every season, creating a continuous, redundant, multi-channel stream of seasonal information that allowed precise positioning within the annual cycle at any point in the year. The biological calendar of the local ecosystem was an annual timekeeping system of remarkable resolution, available to any community with the observational history to have encoded its patterns. The specific phenological knowledge of the seasonal timing of biological events, maintained by traditional communities in multiple cultures has been documented by researchers as both accurate and precise. The traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous communities in various parts of the world consistently includes accurate predictions of the seasonal timing of specific plant and animal events, calibrated to the specific local ecosystem and transmitted across generations with the care that survival-critical knowledge receives. This knowledge was not passive background awareness, it was actively organized into something functionally equivalent to a calendar. A structured understanding of the annual cycle in which specific events were understood to cluster at specific times and to predict or precede other specific events in a chain of seasonal markers that allowed continuous temporal orientation. Let's talk about the social dimension of ancient timekeeping, because while much of what we have discussed is individual or small group knowledge, the coordination of larger communities across time required shared temporal frameworks that were maintained collectively. The seasonal aggregation events that brought multiple ancient bands together, the gatherings at specific resource peaks, the social events that maintained the intergroup relationships that sustained long-distance networks, required shared temporal reference points. Two groups planning to meet at a specific location at a specific seasonal event needed to share an understanding of when that event would occur. In the ancient world, this shared understanding was built around the same natural markers we have been discussing: shared astronomical events visible from any location, shared biological markers that occurred simultaneously across a wide geographic range, but also through deliberate social communication. The exchange of temporal information, the salmon are running, the berries at the North Ridge are ready, was a form of shared timekeeping that distributed the monitoring task across a social network rather than requiring any individual or group to track everything independently. This distributed biological monitoring network, in which different groups in different parts of a regional territory were observing different aspects of the local ecosystem and communicating their observations through the social contact that maintained the network, was an ancient shared timekeeping system that was both more comprehensive and more locally calibrated than any individual community's observations could have been. Here is the full picture of ancient timekeeping that emerges. Ancient humans were not drifting through time in an unstructured present, unaware of where they were in the larger cycles of the world around them. They were embedded in a rich, multi-scale temporal information environment. The daily cycle of the sun and animal behavior, the monthly cycle of the moon, the annual cycle of the seasons, the multi-year patterns of ecological variability that they had learned to read with the fluency that any cognitively sophisticated species develops for the most survival-relevant information in its environment. They tracked days through sun position and biological clocks. They tracked months through the moon's phases, with tally marks providing external memory for counts that exceeded easy mental holding. They tracked years through landscape astronomical alignments, phenological knowledge, and the accumulated experiential understanding of seasonal cycles that a lifetime of attentive observation produces. They transmitted this temporal knowledge across generations through the same oral transmission mechanisms that preserved every other category of survival-critical ecological knowledge. And the moon tonight, the specific crescent in the specific position at the specific altitude, tells the ancient person watching it exactly what it has been telling them all their lives. 8 days to full, 20 to new, 10 days to begin moving toward the valley. The information is the same. The sky has not changed. What has changed is that we stopped looking at it.